Happy Sabbath, everyone. Welcome back to everyone in the sanctuary and those who may be joining us online. Join us as we sing our theme song, hymn number 184, Jesus Paid It All.
I hear the Savior say, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left the crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Since nothing good have I, whereby thy grace to claim, I'll wash my garment white in the blood of Calvary's Lamb. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And when before the throne I stand in him complete, I lay my trophies down, all down at Jesus' feet. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow.
Welcome again, everyone. I hope you got fed, not fed up with us, but fed, and you have the energy, hopefully. You don't fall asleep today. But Pastor Stéphane will wake you up, don't worry. He's got some intriguing messages this afternoon, and he's been sharing already a couple sessions. So I'm just going to open up in a word of prayer at this time. Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you once again for the Sabbath, for blessing us with your presence and blessing us with Dr. Stéphane Deaulieu with the messages that you've revealed to him. We pray that you'll help us engage, listen well, and make it applicable to our lives, and that we may draw closer to Jesus. And the point of prophecy is that Jesus may rise in our hearts, and we pray for that and ask for that. And I pray for your Holy Spirit to be upon this congregation and those there by live streaming. Bless each one of us with your presence, and thank you again, Jesus. Amen. Welcome, Dr. Stéphane, come on up.
Thank you, Pastor Cote. Appreciate that. Again, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this afternoon. Nothing better to do than sitting in here since it's raining outside, right? And so, yes, it's been a delightful lunch. Thank you so much for lunch. It was beautiful. I am all filled up now, and so hopefully I don't fall asleep myself, right? And so, but it's good to see you and everyone that is joining online. So Daniel's theology on eschatology ends. All right? If I can have the PowerPoint. Do I need to press a button? Oh, there we go. All right, thank you. And so here is, again, theology on the eschatology, which is a big word. That means actually what the little word in the quotation mark is about the end. All right? And so eschatology is the study of the end. E-N-D. All right? That is really what the word eschatology means. Now, as you know, this has an S to it, ends. Because in the book of Daniel, there is not only one or two passages that talks about the eschatology of the ends. It is actually mentioned in every single chapter, believe it or not. Very interesting. That's why I use the word theology, all right? Because it's a big spectrum of the book of Daniel at large. Now, again, like this morning, we look at the theology on the book of, not theology, but the theology on Messiah in the book of Daniel. In here, I probably won't have time in 1 hour to look at all these particular passages, but I'm going to focus on some passages a little deeper, all right? So I'm going to warn you right from the get-go, it's going to be a little more technical, okay? It's going to be a little more technical. I'm not an IT, but it's going to be technical, all right? And so I'm going to be using, in understanding the book of Daniel, I'm the type of person that you have to go back to the original language to be able to understand what the author, in this case Daniel, trying to communicate. He is trying to communicate. In the book of Daniel, he's using two languages. He uses Aramaic and he uses Hebrew. All right? Those are the two languages. The language of Aramaic, it was the business language of the Babylonians. So everybody, including the Israelites as well as the Babylonian, would have understood this particular language. When he switched after chapter 7 from Aramaic to Hebrew, starting in chapter 8 to chapter 12, is specifically focusing one audience, which is the Israelites. When he's speaking Aramaic from chapter 2, verse 4, all the way to the end of chapter 7, he's expecting to everyone to understand what he is talking about, which was all the Babylonians as well, because it was the business language at the time. So in here, you got to try to figure out what Daniel is trying to say when he uses the word "and," either in Hebrew or in Aramaic. So that's really what we try to decipher and to understand how does that apply for us today. Since it is a apocalyptic book primarily, although it has a classical component as well, especially like Daniel 1, Daniel 3, Daniel 4, Daniel 5, Daniel 6. Those are considered more classical, all right, general umbrella. But chapter 2, 7, 9, part of it, not the whole chapter 9, chapter 10, part of it, chapter 11, yes, chapter 12, yes, those are apocalyptic, okay? So that is where we're going to try to go today. So let me give you an introduction. The introduction in here is theology found in the book of Daniel regarding the concept of ends, reveals a understanding intended by Daniel, so it's intended with a purpose, that is still applicable to who? To us. You're exactly right. To us today. I strongly believe that. So it is not only applicable to the time of Daniel, but it is still applicable for us today. All right? So I'm going to use another word here, the en motif. Because the word en, it's more of a motif. It's not fully an illusion. A motif is lesser than an illusion when it comes to apocalyptic genre. Okay? So we're going to look at passages. I'm going to give you just in here two passages. In Daniel 1, verse 18, Daniel 2:28. We're going to focus on Daniel 2:28 and 29 here in a minute. But just to give you a little bit of what's happening in these two chapters. Chapter 1, most people don't think that there's a eschatology. Well, there is. Verse 18. Now at the what? What's the next word? En. Now I put the Hebrew word there, ketzat, of days. So at the end of days. Interesting. So Daniel in here, even in Daniel chapter 1, he is already giving us a motif of the eschatology, of about the end. So it does not start with chapter 2, as most people begin. Most people go in chapter 2 when they talk about the end of days. But chapter 1, verse 18, he already alluded to this. So at the time, or at the end of time in this particular translation, that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. That's the full verse. Okay, so that's what we're saying. So the words, the end, ketzat of days, it's very important. What end of days is he talking about? That's a question. In this particular chapter, which end of days is he talking about? Any thoughts? Yes? Chapter 1, yep. Okay, all right. Okay, excellent. Let me read maybe verse 17 to give you a little bit more of a context. It says, God gave these 4 young men, that's Daniel and his 3 friends, knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Wisdom literature, I teach a course on that, all right? So in here, literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. But has there been any vision and dream so far? Not yet, until chapter 2, right? Verse 18, at the end of time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19, the king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians, the mediums in his entire kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. It does, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I should have done that first. I should have read those verses. So, again, let me ask you this question. What end of times is he referring to in here? Okay, say that a little louder. I didn't hear the last couple words. Okay, all right. Okay, so you're suggesting a little kind of a broader understanding of the word end of days. Is that what you're suggesting? Okay, perfect. Okay, yes?
I don't have a solid answer. All I can do is just speculate a little bit, just on
Yep.
different things out there. So verse 17, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill and all wisdom, learning and wisdom, and Daniel has understanding in all visions and dreams. So we've seen this in like Joel, we've seen this in Acts. It always seems to be like after they have gone with these, people that are forgot about this. All these people that are worldly, but have been involved in like sorcery and seeing and things of that sort of nature. Thank you, Naomi. It seems to me that maybe this is like everyone is interested in this particular subject matter. They've been brought into this course. I was talking about the end of days in regards to that particular time period. But because this is about Daniel, like everything else, right? There's always a one time here, and there's always a future time, and it's a typology of something that's going to happen in the future.
Okay.
This is the best I got for now.
Okay, that's okay. No problem. Excellent. Okay. So that's something you got to kind of ask yourself, right? Now, this is very interesting. We didn't read the entire chapter 1, obviously, in here. And verse 17 to 21, it's almost like an interlude between what happened prior in chapter 1 and what's going to happen in chapter 2. It's already predetermining what is going to happen in chapter 2. It's giving us a hint, all right, that someone can interpret. And his interpretation about dreams and visions, it's going to be about what? What's on the screen? It's about the end of days. Now it goes back to the concept that this is end of days, open-ended, so to speak. It's not a pointed of time, it's a continual of time. All right? It is a broader perspective about the end of days, but not in a specific 2025, so to speak. All right? That's really what the author here is trying to portray, what Daniel is going to do in the remaining of the book. That the broader concept about end of days. All right? Now, this becomes very important because talking about the eschatology in here, when you think about eschatology, oftentimes we talk about eschatology and we are thinking eschatology, second coming of Christ. That's oftentimes what we think. But Daniel, eschatology is a lot broader than this. Yes, it does include the second coming of Christ, but it includes a variety of all kinds of other things as well. So it's a big umbrella that encompasses many components of the end of days. Okay? So that becomes very important. So I won't go there more, but we're going to move to chapter 2, verse 28. It says in here, he has disclosed to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen at the end of what? Days. Oh, look at the Hebrew word. Well, is it Hebrew? It's Aramaic. All right? It is different than in verse 18 of chapter 1. You have the word there, spelled in English, katsat. But in chapter 2, verse 28, it's behakarit yayamim. All right? So this is a different. It is actually what we call a lepex haganaman, which means actually is the only place in Aramaic that we have the words the end of days found in the entire Old Testament. It's not found anywhere else. That is the only place in here. So how do we determine the meaning when it's not found in any other places? Yeah, so these particular words in here, in Aramaic, those are the only place in the entire Old Testament that these words are found. In Aramaic, or any close related equivalents in Hebrew, spelled similar to this, is not found either. Yeah. So this is very, very interesting. So now how do we interpret this when we don't have any other point of reference to know what was Daniel trying to talk? So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that particular passage because we need to try to understand, especially because it's apocalyptic in chapter 2, and it will help us to understand other chapters in the book of Daniel when it comes to eschatology of ends, all right? So we are going to look, I have the words in there in Aramaic, in the latter days, all right? So that's how it would be spelled, if it would be spelled in Aramaic. So this becomes important. So let's read it in English. So let's go to Daniel chapter 2, verse 28 and 29, so that we can understand a little bit what is happening in here. So in chapter 2, verse 27, we're told that Daniel answered the king. All right, so the king had already shared the vision, the dream, that the king Nebuchadnezzar had. So the king had a vision, and Daniel was brought up, and now Daniel's answering. He says, no wise man, medium, magician, or diviners is able to make known to the king the mystery he asked about. No one. Oh, that's a tall order. What does that mean about Daniel, including? Because we know he can interpret visions and dreams. But he says, no one. But he's right. Verse 28, but. That little word. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has let King Nebuchadnezzar know what will happen in what? What's the next couple words? Yes, in the last days. Interesting enough. Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
I just want to go back to the first time of chapter 1.
Yep.
Now you're looking at chapter 22, where it's kind of switch over ladder. Sorry.
I will do this again, sorry. I just want to go back to Daniel chapter 1,
Yep.
where it first talks about it. Now we're in Daniel chapter 2. It's being done in a different language.
Yep.
So from what you're saying, where he's with everybody, the soothsayers, everybody that's part of this whole thing, he can interpret dreams. Can we assume, or can we deduce, I think it's probably a better word, can we deduce that the soothsayers and the astrologers and all sort of stuff could also interpret certain types of dreams?
Correct.
Thank you.
Yep. That's the short answer.
So then that also means now that because they couldn't do it, now because there's some common type of knowledge, whatever it is, mystic knowledge, laws of attraction, laws that God has created through this universe, whatever it is.
Yep.
Now all of a sudden God's actually showing, but I created the laws. I created the universe. I'm the one that's telling you, you are above the other people that have common knowledge. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Because you see the magicians, the astrologers, their approach was not done from a God speaking to them.
It was from logic.
Not even from logic. There was to a certain degree, but they would actually kill an animal, open it, and look at the liver. They would look at the liver, and they would look at the intestines, the heart, the kidneys, and they would actually tell the future based upon what they would see. That's how the Babylonian astronomers, magicians, and whatnot were actually referring to visions and dreams and whatnot.
Was there any logic behind that?
Very little
I'm going to
logic.
say that out loud just to be clear.
Yep.
Was there any logic behind that? Was there any reason, like some realistic reason why they would do that?
Yeah, the reason why they're doing that is because they don't believe in one God. They're polytheistic. They believe in many gods. And so therefore, their cultural components in understanding how the world that they're living in at the time, it was interpreted to whatever the gods had provided from nature to help them to understand the future.
We have in here in North America, especially in the West Coast, like the First Nations over here.
Yep.
There were some Adventists who actually started studying this. They didn't know anything about the Bible. They didn't know anything about Jews, but they were able to look at history. Look at nature, look at trees, look at everything, and they pretty much lived like Seventh-day Adventists and with the Great Spirit without even knowing.
Yep.
So I just have to assume that there's just one culture of many cultures that would have been able to interpret nature in certain ways. Is that accurate, and that's where these things are in regards to what's going on in Daniel's courts?
Well, it would be different than the example that you have just given to us, because they're coming from an ideological perspective that is based upon idolatry of different gods and whatnot. That's why even in the Hittite culture, the Canaanite culture, when they worship, they would cut themselves. They needed to have certain type of bloods, for example, for God to answer. They would have orgies so that procreation happens, and so rain could come, and so on and so forth. So their ideology in terms of what is perceived and understood is based upon how they evaluate it in terms of how they perceive nature and how God works through nature. So it's slightly different, but it has some similarities. Because if we're left without believing in God, we will come up with our own spiritual journey. And that's what they were doing. Yeah. Okay? So let's come back to this in here, in this particular passage. So now I'm going to be a little more technical in here. So verse 28 and 29, how do we understand this, right? This becomes really the key. These texts belong, like I pointed out, to the Aramaic portion of the book of Daniel, which begin in the middle of chapter 2, verse 4, all the way to chapter 7. And the word Baharit Yamoya is a literal, actually, rendering of the Hebrew Baharit Yayamim. All right? And so, which, as far as we know, appears nowhere else, as I pointed out, in the Aramaic literature. Nowhere else, even outside of the Bible. So the meaning of the Hebrew expression, therefore, becomes very important in determining the sense of what Daniel is trying to communicate in here in Aramaic, in chapter 2, verse 28. All right? So Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream which deeply disturbed the king. To avoid being deceived, he demanded from his wise men to tell him the dream before interpreting it. Fair enough, right? When none of them could do so, opportunity was given to Daniel. There's a chance to rise. And who, by the power of God, was able to tell the king what he had dreamt and to interpret the dream for him. And that's why he says nobody knows. He includes himself. He does not know. Daniel has no skills and ability beyond this world. It has to come above this world. That's what he's suggesting. It has to come from someone greater than humanity. Okay? So the immediate context of Daniel 2, in here in verse 28, describe the situation where Daniel is brought into the king's presence and declare his readiness to interpret the dream. But in verse 27, I did read verse 27, where it says, Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. So what's the word mystery? Let's look at the word mystery for a minute. Because mystery, what was the mystery of the secret about which the king inquired? That's really what it is. It's a mystery. Only God, who has foreknowledge, can reveal the meaning. So the king had gone to sleep with the affairs of the kingdom in his mind. He had wondered what the future had in store for him, right? Especially when you hit 50, you wonder, okay, what's going to happen in the next 20 years? Okay? So for him, he's in charge of his kingdom. So he goes to bed, he's wondering about his kingdom in here. And so he, Nebuchadnezzar, had just begun the brilliant reign. How would it end and how would it follow? Will it last 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? You always wonder, right? And so in here, what the king expected was some information concerning the future of his kingdom. That's really what he's looking at. He's concerned about what? About his future, his kingdom. That's really what he's looking. So, in here, neither wise men, Arioch had pointed to Daniel and said, hey, he, Daniel, can make known, and Daniel disclaimed any such ability and pointed out to the men cannot perform the prerogative that God alone can do. And so, however, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Now, the word, again, was used in verse 27, used in verse 28. And he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar. Well, did he? What will take place in what's the next few words? Latter days. That's what the king was wondering. What will happen to my kingdom in the future? So the term latter days, what is it talking about? What is it referring about? In the latter days, and he says, God has revealed a mystery to this king. But did it stop with only this king? No, God actually revealed beyond the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. So the word latter days in here, we kind of get a sense, it's already very broad. It's a broader stroke, paintbrush stroke, talking about the end, latter days, but not in details. There is no details per se that will be given in here. So, correct. Yes, exactly, the four world empires. And so this was your dream, he says, Daniel, and the vision in your mind while you are on your bed. Now, he says, God in heaven, Daniel now introduced, he says, the king to the true God who dwells in heaven, in contrast to the visible idols, Babylon who cannot reveal secrets. At the same time, Daniel tells the king that his dream is an inspiration from one true God. So in the latter days, come back to that word, these words, Behemoth Yamoya, if this phrase were apex legomenon and we had only the context, therefore we need to ask a question, what would be our conclusion? Right? We would naturally conclude that Daniel referred to the time which Nebuchadnezzar had in mind. If the dream was the divine answer to Nebuchadnezzar's query, what else could we expect? Right? So when we look at our investigation so far in here, the 12 OT texts in which there's only 12 passages in the Old Testament who has the exact same words, all right? In Hebrew, not in Aramaic, because we don't have an Aramaic, that refers to the latter days, needs to be our guide in understanding what Daniel is trying to talk about. So the context of Daniel 2:28 seems to indicate the future of Babylonian wine. This was uppermost in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar. That's very important. But what God showed him, the king, concerned not only the future of Babylonian wine, but the future of the world history. Down to the end time. Okay, that becomes very important in here. Nebuchadnezzar saw the future of his kingdom as well as the future of the three empires succeeding him, and he saw the rise of many subsequent nations which would coexist but not united. Finally, he saw God would set up his own kingdom which would last forever. Now, my point in here, I already alluded to it a moment ago, he is not going in details. He is giving a broad picture about the latter days. There will be kingdoms, and then there's going to be a final kingdom. He does not give the details about what is going to happen. Now, this is very, very important in what he's trying to communicate. So, as for you, O king, he says, while you are on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, Daniel says. And he who reveals mystery has made known to you what will take place. Verse 29. Now, this becomes important because even in verse 45 of Daniel 2, there is something mentioned in there that is also very important. All right? So let me move in here. All right? So there is one scholar by the name of Cal, a German scholar. He expressed, and he says that verse 28 in here is not explained by the way of what we call in Hebrew the Madelehi, what we see in verse 29, which refers to what shall be after this. That would be the Aramaic, okay? But through the future history of the world, he says, to which God, the revealer of secrets, unites his messianic revelation. Now, did we talk about the Messiah this morning? So it's related to the end and the messianic component. That's what Karl, this German scholar, is suggesting, okay? So very important. Now, let me put a slide, because there's a parallelism between verse 28 and verse 29 that is very crucial. Verse 28, we are told God reveals secret and made known to the king. Well, verse 29, it says the revealer of secrets made known to you. You see the parallelism? It's almost, not quite, word for word. Again, verse 28, what shall be in the latter days, Beherit Yamoya, verse 29, what shall be after this? Ahar dana. That different wording in Aramaic. But it has the same connotation. Why? Look at the next. It says, verse 28, the vision of your head upon your bed. And verse 29, your thoughts on your bed. So because Daniel uses verse 28 and 29 as a parallelism, demonstrating between verse 28 and 29 how, as 3 pointer we call it, he interpret and relate to the same parallelism what is in the middle about the latter days in verse 28, and what is in verse 29 after this must have the same connotation. All right? That is very clear. And the majority of scholars have noticed it. They have seen this particular component. They have noticed that Daniel, even though he's using a different wording, he is referring to the same concept in here. All right? So that becomes important. So, yes, differentiation between the Beharit Yamor of the future for the sake of keeping the former as a eschatological expression is difficult sometimes to maintain, but in here there is an interesting parallelism, as we see, that we cannot ignore. All right? It's definitely there. Actually, some have suggested that there is what we call a very similar chiastic parallelism structure, which is the Hebrew mindset. All right? They're trying to bring something clearly to the audience that clearly explain what the author is trying to drive home. Okay? So it's used all over the Bible. Okay? So to insist that what God makes known to the king in verse 28, what shall be in the latter days, is something perhaps different from what God makes known to him in verse 29. Example, what shall be after this is against the parallelism of flow of thought, if it would be different. Right? So the subject matter of the story is the king's dream, the whole dream, not only the final part of it. Now, let me say that again. That's very important. It's the whole dream. That's the matter of the story of the king's dream, the whole dream, not only the final part of it. So in here, Daniel is not focusing only on the final part. It's the entire dream, but it shows where it's going to finish. It starts with a kingdom, Babylon, and it will finish with a kingdom. Okay? So that's what he has in mind. But he says this is way beyond your time. All right? Thus, if after this refer to the whole vision, as all admit, then the latter days must also refer to it. It has to be the same. A second argument in here is that the general nature of these two temporal, because the temporal expression, is further emphasized by the third temporal phrase, in verse 29, where it says, what shall come to pass? I don't have it in here. All right? So that is the third components that becomes very important. What shall come to pass? What temporal components is this referring to? This phrase is also clearly non-eschatological. Fully understand that. But it reiterates that God is going to reveal to Nebuchadnezzar exactly what he asked for. The future of the kingdom and those after it. That's what it means. So therefore, it's talking indirectly about a linear time. All right? It's called a linear time. Now, this is true. The vision does not stop with the history of successive empires. The vision leads up to the climax of history, the setting up of the heavenly kingdom, but all of the temporal expression embrace the total time span in here. A third argument in here is that the comparison between verse 28 and verse 45, I didn't read it. Let's look at verse 45 in chapter 2. It says, you saw a stone break off from the mountain with other hand cutting it, and it crushed its iron, bronze, fire, clay, silver, and gold. The great God has told the king what will happen in the future. All right. So in here, if you compare 28 with 45, Daniel 2 points to some type of conclusion. Daniel 2:28, the prophet says, he, God, has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. But in verse 45, he says, Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain with our hands, and that is crushed, the iron, bronze, clay, silver, and iron, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So verse 28, therefore, where the vision as a whole is introduced, Daniel uses the same expression, latter days, in here, which is supposed to be eschatological in term, but in verse 45, where he specifically speaks about the same components, the same concept in a messianic kingdom. He uses the exact same phrase, actually, that we find in verse 29, and this seems to be general agreement that it is a non-eschatological, but if the Beharit Yamoya, in the latter days, is really the eschatological terms, and that their Aharadonat is not, one would expect that the former expression be used in verse 45, in the latters of 28. All right? Yes, I see a question. Maybe the mic will need to travel.
I'm just curious, is there a connection with Daniel 7, 13 and 22 with the Hebrew word Yom in Ancient of Days?
Yes. Yes. So there is definitely a component. I do have a slide. Hopefully I'm going to get to Daniel 7. But yes, there is.
The same word.
It's the same word in the Aramaic. Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yom.
Yep, exactly. Correct. Okay, another question in the back? Yes?
If you explain that.
Yes, that's a great question. There's a dissertation actually written on looking at all the expression of mountains in the Old Testament. And very interesting, this particular author demonstrates there was a concept, a theology, that the god or gods always live in the mountains. It's always in the higher places. That's why Elijah, where does he go when he wants to invoke the God? At the Mount Carmel, and so on and so forth, all right? So there is a ideology in there that God always lives in the mountains. So in here, very interesting that Daniel, of course, is familiar with this concept, and he talks about this particular mountain, a mountain where there is a part taken off that mountain, who is that rock that comes to smash the statue. It's revealing that where God would be living, so to speak. But also mountain, it's not always a literal component of a true mountain. And Daniel tried to use it a little more vague. He does not specify which mountain. It's almost like he leaves it ambiguous purposefully to try to demonstrate that he's talking about a different type of mountains, not a earthly mountain, but a mountain actually where the true God of heaven lives, so to speak. And so that's kind of why he leaves it ambiguously. Now, if you look at the book, the Pentateuch, the book of Moses, God appears where? Always on the mountain, Mount Sinai, all right? He appears on Mount Nebo and other places, all right? And so this becomes very important because in here, Daniel's using what we call a motif that has been shared from the Old Testament, from the Pentateuch, former prophets, wisdom literature, and now in his apocalyptic, he's using this concept, but more vaguely, perhaps not allowing humanity to try to determine a specific literal mountain, because that's what we would do. And so he leaves it purposely vague so that our mind is not drawn to a specific mountain here upon the earth, but our mind is directed heavenly mountain, so to speak. That's kind of what he's trying to allude in this very case, because it's a kingdom that is not of this world, it's the kingdom that is out of this world, represented by this rock that will come and smash that statue. All right? Okay? So this is very interesting components that we're seeing in here. A fourth component is that verse 29 and verse 45 constitute a frame of the whole vision, all right? And thus Daniel at the beginning and the end of the vision state that God revealed to Nebuchadnezzar what will come after this. So in verse 29 and verse 45, he uses the same words, after this. Okay? So after the present time, as Daniel 2:28 in parallel with 29 points out the same as we're seeing in here. So for these reasons, it leads me to conclude, therefore, that the word ahar dena, which is referring to what shall be after this, okay, in this context is synonym to Beherit Yamoah, all right, at verse 28. That both refer to the future that's the key word now. If you missed everything else I said, that's what you need to remember. It refers to the future in general. That's my conclusion. And that this future reaches down to the end of time, yes, and includes the setting up of God's stone kingdom. And therefore, while he's establishing this, it's referring to a time that we do not know. It is not a literal time. It's a time in the future, but in general, which I love that Daniel is doing this. Why? Because Jesus responded to the disciples. You remember in Matthew chapter 24, the disciple says to Jesus, "When will this time be?" And how does Jesus answer? Yeah, exactly. That's not for me to decide. I don't know the hour and the time. If Daniel would have given us a time, a specific time, there would be a lot of articles written by people. I've already had something that came on my desk that supposedly the end of the world is coming in 2027. All right, good thing I'm not basing my fate upon this particular article that came on my desk. Okay? But this is very interesting. We don't even have a biblical time, but people over the ages always trying to point a time when Christ will return. Yeah, we cannot resist it. So Daniel does not give us a specific time. In here, he is giving a future component, but it's a general idea. It's open-ended, if you please. Yes, exactly. So I just wanted to point this out, that Daniel, when it comes to eschatology and the understanding of ends, it's more general. It's not specific. And too often, us as human beings, we try to be specifics. We want specificity. But that's not the purpose of apocalyptic genre. It's to be more nuanced. All right? So while as humans we like to be specific, we like details, Daniel, through the inspiration of God inspiring Daniel, he leaves it actually broader. It's more open. Okay? That's what I want to highlight. If you forget anything this afternoon, please just remember this. This is very important. Okay? In my belief, I think this is very important. So I'm not going to jump because our time is running very quickly here. I'm going to jump to Daniel 10, okay? In here, verse 14. So let's go to 10:14. It says, "Now I have come to help you understand what will happen." So the angel had come because there's a conflict. So it's speaking to Daniel. What will happen to your people in the what? What's the next few words? In the last days. Yes, in the latter days. For the vision, singular, refers to, what's the next few words? Those days. Very interesting. So in here, in Daniel 10:14, now we are going into Hebrew, no longer Aramaic in here. The last 3 chapters of the book of Daniel constitute, as I pointed out this morning, as one unit. Okay? Chapters 10, 11, 12. It's one, what we call pericope, one unit. It should come all together, not separately. And so in here, Daniel 10, we have the report of a vision, which is followed by the audition in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12. So the vision of Daniel 10 prepares Daniel for the audition in which the content of Revelation is given. So the time of the vision, according to Daniel 10:1, let's look at chapter 10, verse 1. It says, the third year of King Cyrus of Persia. Oh. A message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. The message was true and was about a great, what? Conflict. Or I like to say great controversy. He understood the message and had understanding of the vision. So in here, verse 1, was the third year of Cyrus. Let me ask you this question. When was the third year of Cyrus? Which year was that? Does anyone know? Yeah, you're correct. You're on the right road. 5. Oh, I see. Okay. So you're talking about Darius in here, 550. But Cyrus, the third year, would be 536. 536 BC. Okay? All right? So in here, the place was the bank river of Tigris. Interesting enough, where Ezekiel actually was. And Daniel had been praying and fasting in here for 3 weeks in order to understand God's plan of the future of his people in verse 12. After explaining the delay in verse 13, the angel says in verse 14, now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days. The second half of verse 14 in the Hebrew reads, and here, which literally means for yet a vision for the days. That's how it should be translated from the Hebrew, literally, okay? So some interpreters understand this to mean the vision in for many days. It points to the distant future, or the time of the vision will cover quite a period yet to come. Other scholars understand it to mean there is still a vision regarding those days. So some have interpreted differently. Those days being the latter days just mentioned. So the latter interpretation seems to be correct in one sense. Here is the same, again, most likely refer back to the vision of interpretation of Daniel 8, if it's referring to the vision, and Daniel 9. Consequently, this phrase seems to emphasize that there is still another revelation to come concerning the future of God's people. And is there? Absolutely. It's found in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12. All right? So the understanding of the latter days in here, in chapter 10, verse 14, in this verse, again, varies considerably among scholars, and a number of people have interpreted sometimes almost as a gap theory. Have you ever heard this? The gap theory? Some people are trying to move this particular passage, Daniel 10, 11, 12, as a gap. But verse 35 and 36, which is supposed to extend from the time of the Maccabees to the last 3.5 years before Christ's second advent, these last 3.5 years are accordingly in the latter days. But other scholars seem to say, oh, this is referring to Antioch Epiphany, especially what we call the people by the name of dispensationalism. All right? Now, all this seems right, but my key word is seems right. All right? It's not what I'm accepting. It's not what I'm proposing in here. But the latter days here has to do more about the future. Because Daniel 10:14, the prophet is told that the angel has come to give him understanding of what will happen to his people on the latter days. So the prophecy is the form of audition which is given in Daniel 11 and 12, runs from the days of the prophet, from the days of the Persian kings, chapter 11, verse 2, down to the very climax of human history, which is in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Since this prophecy deals primarily with the history of mankind between these events. Only a few verses at the end actually deals with the time of the end. We must ask, therefore, do the latter days refer only to the last part of the prophecy of Daniel 11 and 12? Or to the whole sweep of history presented therein? I suggest that we should take this as a whole sweep of history. So therefore, latter days, again in here, it's not a period of time. It's more of a general. It's a sweep of history. That's what Daniel, again, in here in Daniel 10:14, he is trying to refer and to point to. So in order to understand this, it becomes important to understand that latter days in the book of Daniel has the same as that time that we find in Daniel 12, verse 1. And that would help us to understand, as I pointed out this morning, you remember I talked about the Messianic? The Daniel 10, verse 13 we look at, and Daniel 12, verses 1 to 4 about the Messianic are what we call the bookends. But the same concept in verse 14 now in chapter 10 and chapter 12, verse 1, we have at that time in verse 12, is actually the bookend as well. It is trying to refer to the content in the middle. It's talking about the sweep of history about the latter days. So let me suggest, and I hope I don't sound as a heretic, okay? That therefore for Daniel, the latter days, it's not only in the future, but it starts with the time of Daniel and it runs to history, the world history, all till an end will come. So for Daniel, eschatology of end, it's not a period of time, it's general, and it runs from the time of the prophet all the way until Michael returns. So in other words, it's a lot broader. So the eschatology in the mind of Daniel is actually encompasses centuries and centuries of time, from the time of Daniel until Christ returned. Wow! So it was the time of the end for Daniel. Interesting. But yet, it wasn't, because it's yet to come. And it is the time of the end for me. But if I died in 20 years from now, it's not yet, because it will be for the next generation and the next generation. You see? So it is a lot broader in the mind of Daniel when it comes to the latter days. All right? Does that make sense? Okay? So Daniel, he is not, again, majoring in minors. He is not trying to look at a point of time. He is looking from a bird view, if you please. All right? It's like if you would have a drone. You bring it up in the sky, and you can see a lot better than if the drone would be only at 6 feet from the ground. All right? So here it's very high, and it sees a lot wider. And that's what actually Daniel is doing in here. Okay, so in summary, I'm just going to share this briefly here from Gerhard Fendel. He says the Baharit Yamoya in Daniel 2:28 and 10:14 are equivalent expression referring to the future history of earthly kingdoms viewed from the standpoint of Daniel, he says. Yeah, and I agree. That's exactly what I have also found in here. So I'm going to open it for question and answer. I know it's 3:29, but we'll take a couple minutes for question and answers, all right, before we move into our last presentation. So question and answers. And there's a mic that roams as well, all right?
Is there any language in this book of Daniel that helps us to present it to people who do not know God, who are not familiar, and do not believe that this is not just a fairy tale or, just an ancient myth about King Nebuchadnezzar or something like that, which is not true. We do believe it's true, and it's a presentation of all the human history.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence, like maybe linguistic or any specific terminology that helps us to use when we are talking to a very secular people and very smart people who do like terminology and
Yep.
who do get biased when we are using this scientific terminology to convince them or to sound realistic but not like an old story or fairy tale? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There are some books out there, definitely, that are more from a historical perspective. If you go back, even in libraries, like university libraries, and you look in history books during the 600, 500, 300 BC, they are actually, the scholars are right on the kingdoms and the dates and whatnot. So in terms of history, definitely that would be the best approach for me. When I talk with people, history, it's very hard to forge. I mean, you can forge it, but when you have several and many scholars who are saying similar or the same thing about different kingdoms, when they were and whatnot, and it demonstrates and it shows when they failed and they rise and so on and so forth, then by showing the history and what is happening, then I would read it in parallel with Daniel 2, for example. And then it would show that Daniel 2 is not a fairy tale because it was written before those scholars talk about these things and demonstrating when Babylon rise and when he fell, when Medo-Persia rise and fell, and so on and so forth, because it's from a historical perspective. So I would strongly suggest, yes, history books during that time that demonstrate about these kingdoms. Yeah, in which there's many of them. And you don't have to read the entire book or all the books, but you could even PDF some files and whatnot, and then along with Daniel 2, for example, you could bring this along as a parallel with it.
My question was more about the language in the book of Daniel.
I
Is
see.
there any term, that really links us? Like maybe there is a, metaphor that is used not only by Daniel, as you mentioned before, like those old days, and this phrase existed just maybe in the book of Daniel, but we know about the book of Solomon, for example, that his book of Ecclesiastes was written not just because he wanted to write so, but because it was a tendency. It was a trade of that time, and he was in a flow of the time.
Yeah.
And he wrote this book just because all the other wise men in other cultures were writing similar poetry or books of wisdoms.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying,
I see. So you're talking about-
how is the language itself, the terminology of the book of Daniel, is connected to the wider
Culture of the time.
context
Yeah.
of the culture of the time.
I see.
Maybe there is, because you've done like these studies, like connections with Aramaic or Hebrew words. Maybe there are some studies. I don't know.
Yeah.
You
Yep.
dug in more.
That's a very good question.
Like, are there any specific, that we can use as a hook? Oh, you know what? There is this expression, and that was used at the time not only by Daniel, but it was kind of on in the language of people of those days, and that's how we know it's not just a made-up story by Daniel, but it's something that is taken to illustrate that it was true, but the language is the language of that time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm understanding. That is an excellent question. Yes, I'm trying to formulate how I can answer that question.
Are there
They-
any codexes there? Is that what you're saying? Are there other codexes of other books and stuff like that that would have the same
But
language?
yeah,
you're
and she's
saying?
talking more about the cultural, if there would be other understanding of a terminology that would have been understood. There are some books, but many of these books are academic books. And so oftentimes you need to understand the language, like Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, if it's from the Septuagint, or sometimes it's Hittite, Canaanite languages. So it's very academic. So it would need to be translated or put in a language of common people, so to speak, to demonstrate, okay, that particular book from this particular nations, we're using these words, and that's what it meant, or for the Babylonian, or something like that. Yes. So there are some, but it's more academic instead of just common. Yes. Yeah. And it's not, when it comes to the book of Daniel, it's very interesting because the majority of people take the book of Daniel and they place him not in the 600 BC, they place him in the 200 BC. And so oftentimes they're trying to understand the book of Daniel terminology, not from a 600, but from a 200 BC during the time of the Maccabees. And so therefore, some of the suggestion of some of the terminology may not be truthful because it's 400 years later, and sometimes the meanings may have changed of some of the words as well. So to answer your question, it's yes and no. Because the book of Daniel is very unique in his genre. And even though there was an apocalyptic genre with other nations during the time of Daniel, their apocalyptic genre was used way differently or was written differently than the book of Daniel. It had not a divine kind of purpose, but it was trying to demonstrate more of your skill of writing and trying to portray and demonstrate what type of writers you were during that time as well. So there is that aspect also, because apocalyptic, while it was used by other nations, it's not quite at the exact same level that we find in here. Although there is some correlation, there is some similarities in some ways, but when you start digging into a future foreknowledge, the other nation did not have this foreknowledge of interpretation. Yeah, that's a great question. Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. It's very insightful. But to be devil's advocate.
Yes, absolutely.
This text we started with Daniel 1:18. Isn't there an aspect of that is exactly the foundation for the people that wish to use the book of Daniel in general as a historical document of local time in past, so to speak, specifically because when it talks about the end of the days being when it goes on to the king said, gathering, etc., and it's before Nebuchadnezzar. So end of days referring to Nebuchadnezzar at the time.
Yep.
So
absolutely, I would agree with you. So it starts during the time of Daniel.
Yes.
Time of Nebuchadnezzar.
But end of days specifically to Nebuchadnezzar.
Correct.
At that time.
Correct. And then Daniel 2, he takes that and he broadens it.
Fair enough, but nevertheless, isn't this the kind of text that people are starting to use when they're trying to undermine any connection between...
Correct. The preterist, that's what they would do.
That's what I'm going for.
Yep, absolutely. That's what would be a text. But then my challenge to them would be like, look at the wording like I did.
Oh, yes.
And then explore it. But you're right. You're exactly correct.
But isn't this one of the verses they use?
Yep, it is.
To support their timeline as only with Nebuchadnezzar.
That's correct.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. And I would add that most people that interpret, especially when they're trying to relate things to Antioch Epiphany, right, during the time of the Maccabees, it's very interesting of how they read the book of Daniel. They do not start with the beginning of the book. They don't start with Daniel 2. They rather start with Daniel 11. The hardest chapter In all the entire book of Daniel. They start with this one, they come up with an interpretation which is related to the Antioch Epiphany, and then they move backwards. They go to chapter 9, they go to chapter 8, chapter 7, chapter 2. So they start with the hardest and move backwards instead of starting with the easiest and moving forwards. That's what they never do. Yeah. But thank you. Your point is well taken. You're exactly right. Daniel 1:18, that would be a proof for them. Yep. Perfect. Yes.
I have a couple of things I want to ask. I just want to talk about our interpretations of this, as in this particular denomination. Back in the time of James White and Uriah Smith, Uriah thought that the king of the north was not what the little horn power was or any of those sorts of things. And his, if I recall properly, and you can correct me, James's argument was, well, he may have been a little bit, snarky about it, but nonetheless, he was right. It's, if everything else pointed to this, why would the king of the north point to something else? Because you're doing exactly what Yari is saying over here, which is like you have to start with the foundation at the beginning and build your case all the way up here. So so by the time we got to Daniel 11, you should pretty much know that the king of the north must match the little horn power, must match what's happened in Daniel chapter 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now we've come to, and everyone seemed to agree with that. I think Uriah conceded. Now we're coming today, and we have like a very, very popular Adventist ministry, Amazing Discoveries, and one of which is now seems to have broken apart, and people have left a lot of that ministry because now there's someone over there that's going back to what Uriah Smith and is not considering what James said. Like, why would someone go back? Like, what is the logic behind that?
Now, that's a great question. I'm not a church historian. That's not my area, really, so I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer of this because I'm more of a biblical study, so you're asking a question on the Adventist history, and so I don't have an answer and why. But it's a valid question. It's a valid question, good question. I just don't have an answer. Yeah.
Okay. To respond to her question, you were saying that a lot of people looking at Daniel as innocent 200 BC instead of much later, much earlier than that. Let's even go even further, and let's talk about Egyptian history. Egyptian history, there is no history whatsoever in Egyptian history, like hieroglyphics, of the Exodus whatsoever. And which is fascinating because there's so much evidence that the Exodus actually happened. But it just seems to be that they try to cover it up. And now I'm trying to wonder about the time of Daniel, because Daniel obviously was very popular. It was second command, eventually was third in command with the next one. Was there a cover-up of what was going on, especially when you look at Daniel chapter 6?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been in Egypt a couple times. And it's very interesting when you look at the walls and when you look at the history and when you look at the Bible. And Egypt is not alone to do that. Many nations during that time, if they would go into a battle and they would lose the battle, they would never say that they lost the battle. They would normally leave it out or portraying that they are the victorious one. And so the story of Exodus, it's a major battle that they lost. The whole army, the king, and so that's why they don't have it written anywhere. But that said, in the Valley of the Kings, where many of the pharaohs are buried, there's one tomb. Very interesting enough. Now, it does not depict the whole picture. However, this is the only tomb.
It does paint an interesting picture nonetheless.
Correct. That it shows an unfinished tomb of a king, of a pharaoh, that it shows water and it shows corpse floating in the water, which no other tombs portray this. And so it looks like whoever was making the tomb for that particular pharaoh, which is unfinished, very small and whatnot, kind of give an illusion of kind of the Exodus kind of a story indirectly without trying to give too much detail. But yeah, that is the only thing that I'm aware of that we have about that particular tomb. But there is no other writing anywhere in Egypt talking about the Exodus.
Well, let's just go back to
Yeah.
her question in regards to Daniel.
Yeah.
So is there any other writing during that time, during the Babylonian time, during the Babylonian captivity, during that particular time, was there any other writing during that time
Yeah.
that can be used as a reference in regards to what people were writing about nonetheless, and just to basically interpolate? Because we could look at Egyptian history and
Yeah.
we can see a lot of things, like, for example, Pharaoh's tomb that basically was alive and didn't die in the Red Sea is a fake. We know that. We know that the Pharaoh after that was buried on the other side of the river that showed that he had turned monotheistic versus everybody else who was pantheistic, right? Because something had happened. All these different little things. So there must be evidence in
Yeah.
Babylonian time
Yep.
to kind of show, just like there's evidence in Persian history to show that Cyrus, for example, was born and raised much like Moses was.
Yep.
So shouldn't there be something like that in Babylonian time?
Absolutely, they are. And unfortunately, because Babylon is modern Iraq, right? And so during the Iraq War, what was it, 10, 15, 20 years ago now, many of some of the artifacts got destroyed. So we do have some of the components, but while some of the other components that we would love to be able to have access, because it was very hard for people to go and read some of the discoveries that were in the museum and whatnot. But since this Iraq war, a lot of things have been destroyed. Some has been spread out all over the place. And so for scholars to be able to go and examine, it's very challenging because we have only pieces and bits here and there. So we do have, because some people had started to translate it into English or other languages, but again, while reading these, you have to also be careful, as I pointed out, that understanding their cultural, how was it perceived, what was their view, ideology, and whatnot as well. But you're right, there is definitely more, and I think archaeologists will find more evidence as the years goes by. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very good. So let's take one more question, and then we'll take a break. Yes. Well, it does talk about the invasion of Jerusalem, of Judah. So they do talk about that.
I understood that Nebuchadnezzar, he in those chronicles,
Yep.
first 11 years of his reign are described in those chronicles, a part of some other events. So
Okay. So there are what? I missed the word.
11 years of Nebuchadnezzar's
Yep.
reigns, they're described in those chronicles.
Yep, yeah,
apart of
absolutely.
the other events.
Yeah, and it does talk about the description, they use word, but of course it's the Babylonian. They're not written in Aramaic. And it talks also when he went to Jerusalem in 605 and 597. So it points that out, absolutely. But it does not give, for example, if I'm coming back to the term latter days, the chronicles of Babylon do not talk about these particular things. They don't have the same wording or the same conception about this, because it's from a humanistic perspective, the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicles or the Babylonian Chronicles, that from a inspired or biblical perspective. So it's more about the history of the king and what was the king doing, instead of talking about what could have been the future. That's why I was able to talk about the magicians, soothsayers, and how they were doing things by splitting animals and whatnot, because it's written in those chronicles. Yeah. That's how we know that.
Yeah, but the end days terminology in Book of Daniel is not, I think, his invention. I think that even Genesis, Book of Genesis,
Absolutely.
Jacob, and he's saying a prophecy of his sons, he's mentioned, I think, the same word which
Yep.
is used in Book of Daniel.
You're exactly right. No, it is not an invention of Daniel. It is definitely starting with Genesis, I think it's chapter 49. That's where we have the first word. No, you're exactly right. Yeah.
So he's continuing on the, let's say, we say in biblical theology, on the past revelations. That's how I see it.
Well, yes. So I think Daniel, he is expanding it from an apocalyptic perspective because Genesis is using that prophecy more as a classical. But the same terminology is used. And then when we put the understanding, and that's why I use the term, the number 12. We have 12 references in the Old Testament. So Genesis is one of them and other places. It's helping us to understand how Daniel was using this term in apocalyptic perspective. Correct. Yep. Okay, so let's take...
He had one more question.
Okay, all right. Yeah, because it's 10 to 4, I just want to take a break because we have another one. I don't want to keep you here until 10 o'clock tonight. Is that okay? All right. Okay, so let's take a break in here. What should we do? 5, 10 minutes? 5? Okay, so let's take a 5 minutes break and then we'll come back for our last presentation.